I'm here with Mike Campbell, author of Amelia Earhart, The Truth at Last, which is a book that was, the second edition was published in 2013 by Sunbury Press, and also the author of a blog at earharttruth.wordpress.com. And Mike, I guess the first thing I'd like to cover is just sort of the backstory, because it's been over 80 years now, and a lot of people aren't familiar with Amelia Earhart's story. So how did she get to a place in 1937 where she was going to be attempting a flight around the world? What was she known for before that period?
Hi, Leo. Thanks for having me on your program. Good to be with you. We don't have forever because, your time is limited, but so that your listeners understand just the basics, for example, if your readers go to Amazon.com and they plug in Amelia Earhart's name on a search on Amazon, they'll get over 1,500 books about Earhart. Okay, of those 1,500 books, 99.9% of those books are biographies, fantasies, novels, and children's books. Only 10 books out of all 1,500 plus books, only 10 will give those readers any aspect of the truth about the disappearance of Earhart. Okay, now talking about how her bio, her basic bio. Well, between 1935 or 1930 and 1935, she held 8 world and international records in flying. She flew from Hawaii to the United States, from Mexico City to Newark. She flew cross country. She was a one of several very well known female aviators, and they called them aviatrixes, but obviously the word is not even, it's hard to pronounce, and eventually it just fell out of favor, but that's the proper word. Female aviator is a lot easier to say. But in 1932, when she flew over the Atlantic, that's when she became number one beyond a doubt. She became only the second person ever to solo the Atlantic on May 23rd, 1932. Becoming the second person to Charles Lindbergh, who did it in 1928. And from then on, Amelia Earhart was queen of the air, absolutely. And they called her Lady Lindy, and they also called her the First Lady of Flight. So in 1937, she was planning to wind down her incredible career, but with a circumnavigation of the globe. She wanted to fly around the world. She wanted to beat Wiley Post's record of 15,000 miles. She wanted to do it at 27,000 miles, as close to the equator as she possibly could. Without taking all the shortcuts that Wiley Post did to circumnavigate the globe. She did her first attempt. She crashed at Luke Field. She crashed her Electra 10E on takeoff. Witnesses there, especially Captain Harry Manning, who was with her in the cockpit, said that she blew the takeoff. She was overloaded with fuel, and she just missed it, and she crashed the plane. They sent the plane back to Burbank to repair. It took a few months to do that, to repair the plane. While they were doing that, the plan changed from going east to west in the direction. And this time they were going to go from west to east. They took off from Oakland, going across the country, and that was in June. After the plane came out of Burbank, they came out in June. June 2nd, they took off, and they had a few incidents along the way, but I don't know how many stops there were. I don't have that in front of me. About 30 stops, I think. And they finally wound up at New Guinea. They landed there June 30, 1937, New Guinea, and that was the takeoff point for the toughest part of the flight, which was a 2,556-mile flight from New Guinea to Howland Island across the open Pacific Ocean. The flight had never been done before. The island had been cleared by FDR's order. There was an airstrip on Howland Island for her to land on. Outside Howland Island, there was the Itasca, the Coast Guard cutter, which was there with a radio crew to help her, to talk her in, to find the island, which was, a tiny speck of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But she did have the radio equipment to achieve that, and the Itasca was there also. She had a high-frequency Direxit finder, but she left her trailing antenna either in Miami or Oakland. There are different stories, but she could not broadcast on 500 KC, which was the commonly used frequency, and she really hampered herself in that way from the start by leaving her trailing antenna. And so she took off on July 2nd, 1937 at 10 a.m. with her navigator, Fred Noonan, who was the best in the world at the time. He was the brains about the navigation, and he was there to make sure that they found Howland Island. Now, that was the ostensible plan. Okay. Now, nothing happened according to plan, and the actual flight between Howland or between Ley and Howland was a nightmare of communications. The first 8 hours were okay. She was okay with Harry Balfour, the radio operator at New Guinea, and she established a good two-way communication with him for 8 hours. However, after that, she switched off from with Balfour, and she said, "I'm going ahead. I'm going to hook up with the Itasca, with Howland Island, and we're going ahead." And from that moment on, she never established two-way communications with the Itasca. The Itasca did receive 5 or 7 messages from her during that time. And they got stronger as she apparently approached the island. The last message that she sent was received on time at around 19 hours or so, 19 and a half hours of flight. The flight was supposed to take about 20 hours, somewhere in there. 20, 21 hours was the estimate. There's just so much involved with this. But she never established two-way communications with the Itasca, which was very, very strange. She was never on the air longer than 10 seconds at a time. She acted as if she didn't really want the Itasca to get a fix on her at all. 10 seconds was not enough for them to do that. She acted as if she didn't want to hook up with the Itasca and established. She never maydayed. Her last message was, I'll just paraphrasing, we're running on line of position 157, 337. We're running north and south, wait listening. On 6210, that was the one of the 2 frequencies. She said, wait listening, we'll be broadcasting on the half hour. And that was it, officially. She was nobody ever officially heard from her again, and the search began. Shortly thereafter, the Itasca began the search for Amelia Earhart.
Yeah, and a couple things to back up and unpack. I understand that she had taken on quite a bit of fuel in Ley. I think she had her highest load of fuel. And if we could just talk a little bit about the airplane that she flew and sort of what its specs were.
Well, the Electra was state of the art at that time, 1937. Nowadays, it would not be considered much at all. It would be considered an antique, of course. But in those days, the Electra was the Lockheed L-10 Electra was state of the art airplane. Let me see if I can find something here. I have something here.
Yeah, I understand it had like about 1,000 gallons of fuel as its capacity. Does that sound right? Yeah,
plus actually it had 1,100. At the time it took off, it had 1,100 gallons of fuel, 1,151 gallons with the extra tank. Mm-hmm. 1,151 gallons. Its range was said to be 4,000 miles.
Or about 24 hours of flight time, or give or take?
Yes, at least 24 hours. Yes, it had 600 twin Pratt and Whitney 600 horsepower engines, or 1340 Wasp engines. Um, I mean, it was a really a classy airplane for the time. It really it was everything she needed to do the job.
Right.
The mystery of the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, I always say it can't be solved in the air. Actually, there is no mystery, but I mean, even approaching the problem, because the mystery, as we will soon discuss, there is no mystery. We know what happened to her, and then the federal government knows what happened to her. The Electra wasn't the problem.
Right.
No.
And so she was coming into Howland Island, and maybe if we could just talk a little bit about what exactly about that was so. I mean, it was sort of perilous for her to try to hit that tiny island, given the state of technology in the 1930s. And I think that exact flight path has sort of been subject of obviously a lot of speculation over the years. But what exactly about that would have been a difficult approach at that time
Well,
period?
because it had never been done before. But they had the equipment to do it, and there was not a lot of sweat prior to the takeoff. There wasn't a lot of worry expressed by Noonan or her about actually finding Howland Island. Yes, it had never been done before, but they were all set up technically to do it. This is all misunderstandings. When the plane went missing, the search began. Now the search began with the Itasca going northwest of Howland Island and searching the area immediately to the northwest, because that's where the clouds were and the thunderstorms were, or whatever they saw that were, because the rest of the skies were clear and they would have been able to see if she was there. Leo Bellerts, the chief radio man on Itasca, said that her last message came in 5 of 5. Signal strength 5 of 5, and he ran up on deck and he expected to see her on overhead, but he didn't, and so we don't know. But the Navy soon came. They sent the Colorado, the battleship Colorados came on June 9th or July 9th, and then the Lexington, the aircraft carrier with 63 aircraft, came the 11th. And between the battle group of the Lexington, the Colorado, the Itasca, they searched 262,000 square miles of ocean. There was nothing found whatsoever. They were not allowed, however, to search the Marshall Islands. Now, because of the length of your radio thing, we can't get bogged. It's just you don't want to get bogged down in things that they can find out themselves, or that any bio or any biography of Earhart will give them, all about the flight, all about the airplane, and all that stuff. Anybody can find that. Now that stuff can be found online without too much problem or discrepancy. The reason you're having me here to talk with you is because of what my book has to offer, and that is the facts and the truth about the disappearance, which they're not going to get anywhere else.
So where does that story pick up? Because we have pretty much a narrative that's pretty well understood in terms until she disappears. But then, where is it in the 1960s that the public first starts to get the dribble of information about what really became of Earhart?
Yes, for the most part. There was a story done in 1944 from the Marshall Islands by a United Press writer named Eugene Bogan. Did a story about some of her things being found on Kwajalein. That story appeared in American newspapers in 1944 in March. However, very few people took notice of it, and there wasn't much made out of it. The war was still going on. But in 1960, the real modern-day search for Amelia Earhart began with Paul Breon Jr.'s book, The Daughter of the Sky. Daughter of the Sky, the last chapter of Daughter of the Sky introduced the secondhand account of Josephine Blanco Akiyama, because Briand's book began as a garden variety biography. However, during the time that he was working on this book, Briand was a English teacher at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And during the time that he was working on the book, he ran into a Navy, civilian Navy worker, employee named Casimir Sheft, who was a dentist on Saipan in the late 40s. Now, during the time Sheft was on Saipan, he met a young woman named Josephine Blanco. Josephine Blanco told Casimir Sheft about actually seeing Amelia Earhart come ashore on Saipan at Tanapag Harbor in the summer of 1937. She saw a silver plane land in the harbor. She thought we think it was a seaplane. She couldn't identify it as a seaplane or any other kind of plane. She was only 11 years old. Likely it was a seaplane, but it's also possible it was a land-based plane that was in trouble and landed there in the harbor. But soon the flyers were taken ashore. Josephine saw Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan ashore on Saipan at Tanapag Harbor, where it was basically a classified area. She was there because her brother-in-law was working for the Japanese there on their military facilities, and she was there to bring him his lunch. That's the only reason she got in. Very few. There were others. A few other native Saipanese that did see Earhart when she came ashore. Jose Bassa was another one. These accounts are all in my book, Amelia Earhart, The Truth at Last. You can't get bogged down in too many of them. Josephine's account was the most important because because it began the search. Once this account was Briand presented Josephine's account in the book, that started it because people started paying attention then. A guy named Linwood Day, who was a writer for the San Mateo Times, heard about this account in the book in Daughter of the Sky, and he went and he interviewed Josephine Blanco, who was now Josephine Blanco Akiyama. In 1960, she had moved to San Mateo, California. She had been married. She was in her she was about, 30 or something like this. He interviewed her, and he began a series of stories about her. Front page headlines on the San Mateo Times about Josephine Blanco Akiyama and what she had seen on Saipan. Soon Fred Gerner, who was a radio celebrity in San Francisco, a radio newsman, got wind of all this. He went and talked to Josephine, believed her story, and Fred Gerner got CBS to support his trip to Saipan, the first of 4 trips that he took to Saipan, beginning in 1960 in mid-June, and Fred Gerner went and he interviewed 200. Initially, he interviewed 200 native Saipanese. And when he was on Saipan, he wanted to see if he believed Josephine's story, but he needed to corroborate it. So he went there and he found what he called the original 13 people who strongly supported her story. Now, you have to remember, on Saipan, most of the people on Saipan had really good memories of being under Japanese domination. Many of those people on Saipan wouldn't even talk to Gerner about it. They were afraid that the Japanese could come back at any time, and they were afraid of reprisals. There were those that did have the courage to tell Gerner what they saw. Gerner used the services of 3 Catholic priests that were on the island there to translate, because the native Saipanese didn't speak English, most of them. They just spoke Spanish, so he had used these priests to translate, and also because he wanted the truth. He told the priest at the beginning, I want only the truth, and I know they won't lie to you with you around. So this is another thing this is another huge lie that the people that hate the truth always say, or have been known to say about the witnesses on Saipan, that they told Gerner what he wanted to hear. Nothing could be further from the truth. They told him what they knew, and that's it. That's all they told him. So Gruner found his original 13 during his first trip. He went back 3 more times to Saipan, found even more witnesses on Saipan. And in 1966, he published The Search for Amelia Earhart, which to this day is the only book that has sold, that was a bestseller. This is the only book that presented the truth about the Earhart disappearance that was a bestseller. In 1966, it sold 400,000 books, a huge amount of books for that time. And people around the country were shocked by his revelations. Many people believed him, of course, because the book absolutely established the fact that Earhart and Noonan were on Saipan in 1937, and that they died there on Saipan in Japanese captivity. Of course, the American establishment did not want people to know this, but they were caught with their pants down because the book was already out there and 400,000 copies had been sold. Time magazine did their best to squelch the truth. They came out with their review, and the Time magazine review. Remember, now this is 1966. No internet, no cable, 3 networks, and very few news magazines. Time magazine was probably number 1, and Time magazine said, "There's nothing to see here. This is a quote sinister conspiracy." That's what they titled their review. Sinister conspiracy. They did everything they could to throw cold water on the book, and from then on, the idea that Earhart and Noonan were on Saipan was considered only for fringe lunatics, for nuts, for conspiracy theorists, I believe that's where the actual term came from. Conspiracy theorists came from that review done by Time magazine. This is how the establishment smears and discredits those who tell the truth, but that's not in line with what the official line, the approved line is. This is how they smear them. They just call them conspiracy theorists. You hear it all the time now. It's been going on for a long time. This was the root of it, as far as I know, and so that was the beginning right there, Leo, of the problem that we have with the Earhart disappearance. The establishment absolutely despises the truth.
Right, and there's also been declassified CIA memos from around that time period, maybe a little bit after, about using the term conspiracy theorist to sort of throw this kind of stuff down the memory hole, and we've covered a lot of things on this podcast that fit into that same category. I want to kind of back up, though, because we briefly mentioned that the Japanese were controlling Saipan in the 30s, in 1937, when Earhart went missing, and you also mentioned that some of the Saipanese long after were still afraid of the Japanese. Can we talk a little bit about what exactly the Japanese were doing at that time period and why they were so feared later on by their former subjects like the Saipanese?
Well, the Japanese were in 1937 were barbaric people. The military, the Japanese military establishment, they were dead set on conquest. They were about just a few months away from the rape of Nanking. The 1937 December is when they invaded Nanking, and they butchered 300,000 men, women, and children. The Japanese in those days were absolutely awful, and I just published the first of 2 parts of Japanese war crimes. The title, the actual title of my first blog post. Actually, the address of my blog is earharttruth.com. That's a lot quicker to get there than the other way. So earharttruth.com, and
yeah, you just published it on September 25th, and it's called Earhart's Murder Among First of Japan's War Crimes, and it gets into stuff like the rape of Nanking, which was famously covered in a book by, I believe her name was Iris Chang.
Right.
And a lot of this stuff still hasn't come out in terms of, in this very article covers how even recently in 2007, for example, there was a House resolution asking for Japan to apologize, for using comfort women during World War II, and all these sort of subjects having to do with Japan in World War II are very dicey politically because of the close allyship between the U.S. and Japan. Is that correct?
Yes, it is very much so, and we have. Japan has yet to really fully even apologize for some of the things that they've done. They did. Yeah, it's all in the article, and we don't really need to go over it too much. It's just the reason that I included this subsection, Japan's war crimes, in the book is so that people can understand the environment into which Earhart and Noonan had found themselves in 1937. We don't know why they landed at Mili Atoll, but that's where they landed, and that's where they were picked up by the Japanese. Okay, I don't think this was part of the plan. If it was, the plan was very ill-conceived. Some theorists have speculated that they landed at Mili so that our Navy could come in and search for them, and while they were doing so, get a better idea and a better read about what was going on in the Marshalls during that time frame. I don't believe I don't believe anybody could have been that stupid, because the Japanese they just said, hell no, you can't come in here and look for her. This is our property. We have it. It's the League of Nations mandate gave it to us, and we don't want you coming in here looking for her or anyone else. We'll do all that. We'll search for her, and so to think that they'd turn her back over, if that was the plan, and we don't know what the plan was, we could guess what the plan was, but I don't think that was the plan. And the Japanese had her, and once the Japanese had her at Mili, and they turned her over she was turned over on the Japanese fishing boat, we believe, to the Koshu, the Japanese survey ship, the Koshu, a military ship. And she was turned over to that ship, and she was taken from there to Jalawit, and from there eventually to Saipan. So,
and I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a couple other pieces of sections, I guess, that are covered in your book in terms of interlocking evidence, and one of those is about where she landed. There's a lot of other witnesses that saw her come down near Mili Atoll in the Marshall Islands, and there's another sort of set of corroborating evidence that comes from witnesses there. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, there weren't a lot, actually. There were a few that saw her. Vincent V. Loomis went there to Mili and to the Marshalls, and he made 4 trips himself to that area. Vincent V. Loomis presented his Marshall's work in his book, Amelia Earhart, The Final Story. Well, it wasn't the final story. In 1985, though, Loomis's book was very good, and he had a couple eyewitnesses that saw the plane land right off of Barr Island in the northwestern quadrant of Mili Atoll. That's Barre is how you spell it. And one of them was a woman that he just named as Mrs. Clement. He didn't even get her first name. She said she saw the plane land, and then Lehan and Geroro were 2 native fishermen that were there in the area when the plane came down. And one of those 2 actually took responsibility for actually seeing the plane. I think it was Lehan was the one that saw the plane. But the story in the Marshalls spread very quickly. And then at Jalawit, we had Bilamon Amaron, who was called out to the Koshu to take care of the white man's injury. His knee was injured, and he also had a white bandage on his head. And so Bilamon Amaron was called out. He was a 16-year-old Japanese hospital corpsman that worked for the Japanese, not military. He was a civilian, worked for them on Jalawit as a hospital corpsman, and he went out. He was called out to the ship to actually administer to the white man, that he later identified through photos as Noonan, and also Amelia, and when she was she was on the deck with Noonan at the time. And Bilamon Amaron actually told Bill Primack in 1989 uh, a researcher and friend of mine, Bill Primack, who did a lot of really great work, though he didn't have a book. Uh, he told Bill Primack that the crewmen called the woman on deck Melia, Meelya, Melia. So that's Bill Amaran is probably the most important and best known of the Marshallese eyewitnesses.
Right, and there's a couple other things about those stories that sort of lend to them the ring of truth. I'm thinking of, for example, the Marshallese witnesses seeing them inflate a life raft, or their description of that, which I thought was kind of interesting. Can we cover that just really briefly?
Sure. Lehan and Geraro actually described the life raft as a yellow boat which grew to Loomis. This is how an unsophisticated Marshallese islander would describe an inflatable life raft as a yellow boat which grew. We actually looked and identified her different lists of cargo and things that the Electra had, and of course a life raft. And I think we even found that one or two mentions of it was that it was yellow. Now her inventory of her last flight has never really been made official. What she actually had in the Electra when she took off from Leh has never really been known officially, But if she didn't have a life raft, I mean, really, I'm sure she had an inflatable life raft, and that's what the Marshallese saw when they got into it after they crash landed on the reef there, right off of Bar Island. That's what they saw. Then they got in there. Then from there they went into one of the small islands, the Endrican Islands. There's 3 little tiny islands off of Bar, and that's where they were when they were picked up.
Right,
Best evidence.
And the one other thing I think that they described is that Earhart and Noonan may have buried an item near a tree, and I think a researcher later went back and found some suggestive evidence there. Is that correct?
That's right. They were said to have buried
a tin box of some kind?
Right, a tin-looking box. I'm trying to think of. I think it was Leon and Geraro saw them bury this thing under a canal tree. They described this to both Loomis and Oliver Knaggs. Loomis couldn't find it, but Knaggs came back a few years later. Knaggs came back with metal detector and equipment, and he found some local natives that were aware of this, and he eventually found the canal tree, he believes, and he dug it up. He dug up that spot where they were seen to have buried something, and what he found was all pretty much disintegrated from the sand. But he took it back to Cape Town, South Africa, and had it analyzed by professionals at Cape Town, and it was identified as metallurgical in nature, man-made, and that it could have easily been a tin or a metal container, like a little toolbox or something, and then we corroborated that with Earhart's own testimony in her book Last Flight, where she talks about Noonan actually having one of these, a small tin type box, which he kept maps or something in, and so he actually had that, and we know that he had one of those things, and he probably kept some valuable papers in there, and that's probably what he buried.
Right.
And yeah.
And the other, I think, really important set of witnesses that I would like to get to is we move back in time to the end of World War II when Saipan was retaken by the U.S. military. There was a group of military soldiers that saw various things on Saipan after the American forces had reoccupied it. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about that series of events.
Well, we start with well, actually, Thomas E. Devine is the one who really instigated all this and set all this off. Devine was a sergeant in the 244th Army Postal Unit on Saipan. Devine went ashore on Saipan on July 6, 1944, after the island had almost been. It wasn't quite secured yet. They secured it on July 9th, but most of the heavy stuff was over by July 6th. The invasion began July 5, or June 15th on Saipan, and Saipan was an awful, just a bloodbath, a huge battle. The Japanese had 30,000 soldiers in the garrison there on Saipan defending the island. There was a key piece of real estate. We had to take Saipan to progress in the Pacific. If we would not have taken Saipan, we wouldn't have won the war in the Pacific. We had to take Saipan. And so we had like 175,000 men altogether in all shapes and forms. We had over 500 ships. Offshore, we had the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions invaded Saipan. I mean, it was just an awful thing, but it had to be done. So by the time Devine got on Saipan, most of the bloodshed was over. He was there to set up a post office because we were planning to be there for a while. Devine was there for a year on Saipan as part of the garrison force. When he first arrived, he was ordered to take his commanding officer to Ashlito Field, which was the Japanese airfield on Saipan, which was later renamed Isley Field. And at Ashlito Field, Devine saw some Marine officers arguing about who would get credit for finding the Earhart plane. The Earhart plane had been found in a hangar on Saipan. Later that day, Devine saw the plane flying overhead. After it landed, Devine went to the airfield. He stood on the wings of the plane, examined the plane. Later on, he said it was all on the same day. And during the night, he heard an explosion at the airfield. He went to the airfield and saw the plane in flames. The plane had been doused with gas, and P-38 had come overhead and strafed it and burned the plane and destroyed it as much as you can, an all-aluminum plane, and burned it beyond recognition. Now, Devine wasn't the only one that knew this, that saw this happen. Erskine Neighbors, a Marine code clerk who had taken the messages about the discovery of the plane and the plans to fly it and to destroy it. Erskine Neighbors, a very important eyewitness, he was also there at the time the plane was destroyed, as were some other Marines as well. Some Neighbors brought some friends with him, and it was known throughout the island, the word got out fast, that the Earhart plane had been found on Saipan and destroyed on Saipan. But nobody really wrote much about it until Devine came out with his book in 1987 called Eyewitness, the Amelia Earhart Incident. In that book, Devine tells about his own personal experience there, but he doesn't present any eyewitnesses. At the end of his book, Devine asks anyone who was there. You know, he asks former GIs that were on Saipan that had any knowledge of this to come forward and contact him, and so they could establish the truth. And so as a result of that, 26 GIs eventually contacted him with their verbal and written statements, and those 26 those statements became the basis of the book that I did with him, my first book in 2002, With Our Own Eyes, Eyewitnesses to the Final Days of Amelia Earhart. Those 26 GI statements are presented in that book.
Right. And can we maybe just talk about some of the other anecdotes that were presented there, and some of the other interlocking evidence that her plane was discovered in 1944 on Saipan?
Well, I'd have to the major eyewitness evidence where you have lengthy accounts are Devine's account and Erskine Neighbors account. Those are the two major accounts. Other accounts are brief. People talk about one GI talks about being at the airfield and watching the plane burn. It's not. We don't have a lot of lengthy accounts besides Neighbors and Devine's accounts. And for all the details of that, I would suggest that people look at my book.
Right, but I think that there was maybe I'm thinking of some other type of accounts, but I believe that there was somebody that maybe found a briefcase that may have belonged to her and some other.
Oh, that's different.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
That's different.
Can we talk about that?
That was Robert E. Wallach. Now he's one of the most important of all the eyewitnesses on GI witnesses because Robert Wallach was a Marine machine gunner in the 29th Marines, came ashore on Saipan during the second wave, and most of his, or at least half of his group was killed during the invasion. It was really bad on the beaches, especially during the early stages. He survived, and a few weeks later he was looking through a Japanese administration building with some of his friends, and they found a safe, a locked safe on Saipan in this administration building. He also had a demolition guy with him, and so they blew the safe open. And inside the safe, they found Amelia Earhart's briefcase, bone dry, had never been wet. Inside the briefcase were all her visas, her maps, her papers, photos, anything that you can think of that she would have needed to have with her during her round-the-world flight. Her briefcase was found in that Japanese safe on Saipan in June or in mid-July, I'd say, 1944. And so, what's his name? Wallach. Wallach had this briefcase, and it's like he was sitting on a gold mine, and he couldn't. He's a private, and he's sitting on this. What's he supposed to do? He was forced to give it up. He gave the briefcase up to what he called he said it was a naval officer on the beach. He gave the briefcase to a naval officer, and the briefcase was later seen. In fact, was later seen by Erskine Neighbors in the secret radio quarters where the tent was. The Navy officer had brought the briefcase to give to the Marine to a Marine colonel named Colonel Wallace. That is Colonel Wallace, I believe. And he turned it over to him at that point, and from there, the briefcase went into a real black hole and never to be seen again. But it was seen by neighbors before it was actually disappeared by U.S. intelligence assets. That briefcase is, in somewhere in Washington, I'm sure, in the deepest, darkest hole.
Right, and there's been other physical evidence that has sort of fallen into that same dark hole, including probably the remains of Earhart and Noonan. I think that there's another anecdote involving another Marine named Gerald Chatham. Now
the Gerald Chatham's piece of this should come really after the Griswold, Henson, and Burke's piece, because that's a much bigger piece, and it's all of a part, because Gerald Chatham actually encountered the same Marine intelligence officer that Henson and Burke's did. Everett Henson Jr. and Billy Burks were two Marine privates on Saipan in late July 1944 or early August, who were commandeered by a Marine captain named Tracy Griswold, who was a Marine captain who also was working in intelligence on Saipan, Marine intelligence. He took these two Marines to a spot outside this graveyard, this cemetery on Saipan, known as the Liang Cemetery, Liyang. Outside the Liang Cemetery, they dug at a specific spot. Griswold had a map, and he knew where he was looking. So someone had furnished him information, and they dug at a spot. The two Marines did, and they dug down about 4 or 5 feet. They unearthed 2 full skeletons, fully skeletonized individuals with no other remains on them, no skin or anything, just all skeletons. They were. And when they were done with the skeletons, they took them out of the grave. They put them in what Henson called canisters. They put them in canisters, and Griswold put the canisters in his Jeep and drove away. Before he did that, though, Henson asked him what they were doing and what this was all about. And at that point, Henson made his only mistake. He said, "Have you ever heard of Amelia Earhart?" And of course they had. And he said, "Well, enough said. I don't want, and at that point he swore them to secrecy, never to say anything about this detail that they had been on. And they did not say anything about that detail for 24 years until after they had heard about Fred Gurner's work. They contacted Fred Gurner's friend Ross Game, and they got the story to Gurner, and Gurner followed up on that story. Now, as a side note, a guy named Gerald Chatham Jr. was also a Marine on Saipan. In a separate incident in October, was ordered to go to a spot in Garapan. Let me think now. It's not in Garapan, but it was near the Liang Cemetery. It was not the same spot that the Henson and Burks were at, though, but it's ordered to a spot to pick up what he told. This is his account to Thomas Devine, not to Gurner. Chatham told Thomas Devine that he was ordered to pick up 2 boxes labeled Earhart and Noonan bones, and he was ordered to do this by none other than Captain Tracy Griswold. Okay, so this is 2 grave digging expeditions that Tracy Griswold never remembered and denied to his grave ever taking part in, to Gurner and to anyone else that ever asked him about it. However, Griswold was identified by Henson and Burks separately in photo lineups after 24 years. They both separately picked him out of photo lineups, which left no doubt whatsoever that they were telling the truth, and that Griswold was not telling the truth about his involvement with this. And this is where we think the remains of Earhart and Noonan were picked up, were taken from there to we don't know where. And later on in 1968, 1967 or 8, Anna McGoffna, who was a witness to a white man's execution on Saipan in 1937, we believe on the exact same spot that Henson and Burks were digging, took Donald Cathera, who was another researcher, took him to that same spot outside the Liang Cemetery. They dug there and found bone fragments. Those bone fragments in 1968 could not be identified as white or any other kind of bone fragments, although the anthropologist, Dr. Raymond Bobby of Ohio State, did claim that they were from white people. They also found a bridge in that hole, which was a Western bridge, identified as a Western bridge that could have been Newton's bridge. These bone fragments and the bridge were all in Raymond Bobby's possession in 1982 when Bobby died. And after Bobby died, the bone fragments and the bridge disappeared, and they've never been seen since. Now, if those bone fragments had been kept in possession by Cathera or anybody else who was trustworthy, they could be analyzed now. They could have been analyzed maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago for DNA. And we could, through that method, prove that Earhart was on Saipan. Absolutely and without a doubt. But even so, the amount of evidence that we have is so mountainous and it's so overwhelming. We've only touched, in the last 50 minutes or so, we've only touched on some of the high points. There's so much evidence. There's so many threads. There's so many different ways that you can put them on Saipan and not anywhere else. We should talk maybe a little bit, later on about the prevalent and the common ideas that are put out by the media, the common lies. These lies are called theories, but they're not really theories, because we know, and the government knows very well what happened to them. So therefore, it's not a mystery. And I always tell people when I begin to tell my presentations, once in a while I get to do presentations with PowerPoint slideshows and things. And the first thing I always tell people is there is no such thing as the Earhart mystery. This is a lie that's been told for 80 years, and it's become part of our culture. And I understand that it's hard for you to understand this right away and to grasp it. But once you start to look into this and you examine the evidence, you'll see that there is no evidence except for the truth. There's only the truth surrounded by lies. These lies have been glorified to the status of theories, but they're not theories because there is no mystery.
Right, and I think if we do another hour, we could touch on a bunch of that kind of stuff. Some of the other things that have been promulgated over the years, and even there was a recent series of events where there was a photo supposedly unearthed that was alleged to have depicted Earhart and Noonan on Jalluit.
Yes,
and
this is something that your some of your readers or listeners might be aware of, the History Channel special, and it is very confusing to just about everyone that is not really versed in this. This is meant to be confusing for a reason, and we should definitely talk about that later.
Yeah, we can unpack that and some other things. If you don't mind, though, I just wanted to touch on one other thing, because I think it's a really strong piece of evidence in a whole nother category that I think sort of rounds out at least getting a little bit into a lot of these major areas, and that's that there was at least 3 U.S. military flag officers who at various times shared their knowledge with Fred Gorner, the researcher behind the 1966 bestseller, that basically told him that he was on the right track, in essence. And can we just cover that really briefly?
Yeah, sure. We have 3 U.S. flag officers. A flag meaning of admiral or general rank. That's what a flag officer is. And these flag officers that came forward to share the truth with Gorner were not just your ordinary run-of-the-mill flag officers. These guys were really big-time, special guys in the history of this country. The first one being the last of all the 5-star admirals in the Navy, Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet during World War II. Fred Gorner had met him earlier, a few years earlier, in around I think 1962 or 1, something like this. They had done a project. He had done a project with Nimitz, and Gorner had become friendly with him, and he admired Nimitz greatly. And Nimitz knew about his work with Earhart. In 1965, right before Fred Gorner was going to Washington D.C. to interview then General Wallace E. Green. Wally Green was a lieutenant commander, or a colonel, lieutenant colonel, I believe, on Saipan, and he was at the time in 1944. Green was the one who was reputed to have been the one that found the Earhart plane in the hangar. Green had been the one that unofficially got the credit among the troops. So in 1965. Gorner was going to interview Green, who by then had become a general and was in the Pentagon. And so right before he left, Gorner said that in a phone conversation with Nimitz told Gorner, Fred, now that you're going to Washington, I want you to know that the Japanese picked up Amelia and her navigator in the Marshall Islands. That is the quote that was given to Fred Gorner by Chester Nimitz, and he went to his grave with that. Chester Nimitz died a few years after that. He didn't tell him anything else because basically, he wasn't allowed to tell him that. It was a top secret piece of information. He was not supposed to tell him that, but he told him that anyway because he wanted to encourage him. He knew that he probably, Nimitz did not agree with the policy of keeping this under wraps. Later on, we'll talk about why all this is supposed to not be known, why the establishment does not want the public to know, and why the government is never going to not in our lifetimes is never going to tell us the truth about what happened. Okay, so that's the first of the three flag officers. Second, we have Graves Erskine, who was a brigadier general on Saipan in the V Amphibious Corps in 1944 during the invasion. Graves Erskine was second in command on Saipan of the operation on Saipan. Operation Forager was the overall operation to take the Marianas, which included Saipan and Guam. But on Saipan, Graves Erskine was second in charge. The V Amphibious Corps was the organization in charge of the operation on Saipan. So Graves Erskine knew everything that happened on Saipan. And in 1967, after the book was published, Graves Erskine told two of Gerner's friends, associates, in the radio station. Erskine had accepted Gerner's invitation to come on the radio and be interviewed by him. But he didn't tell him this on the air. He told two of his associates this in the green room, or whatever they called it then, as he was waiting to come out. And one of them was Jules Dundee, who was CBS vice president of news at the time. He told them, it's been established that Earhart died on Saipan. I'm going to let you guys dig out the rest for yourselves. Okay? They passed this to Gerner. Graves Erskine was doing the same thing that Nimitz was doing, encouraging Gerner, telling him that he was on the right track, but not telling him anything else. He did not tell him this on the air either, because he knew that he wasn't allowed to. He feared the repercussions, blah blah blah. And he died shortly thereafter too. Not that there was anything sinister. He died of natural causes a few years after this, as did Nimitz. Now we have the third. The third flag officer would be Alexander A. Vandegrift, who was the commandant of the Marine Corps during the Second World War, number one Marine of all during the Second World War. He told Gerner in a 1970 or 71 letter that was written, we believe, by his wife and signed by Vandegrift. He told him in more detail that it was established that Earhart died on Saipan. He was told this by Tommy Watson, General Tommy Watson, who was the commanding officer of the 4th Marine Division, I believe, either the 4th or the 2nd. He wrote this in a letter to Gerner. I have the letter. You have the letter, or if you don't, I'll send it to you. It's in the book. That Watson told Vandegrift that he was told during his inspection, during Vandegrift's inspection tour of Saipan, shortly after the island had been secured in 1944, that he was told about Earhart being there and dying there. And Vandegrift told Gerner, this is the sum total of all my knowledge. I wish you wouldn't quote me on this. Same idea. Okay, same idea. He died shortly, within 2 years after the letter that he wrote as well. And it was the same thing. He wanted to encourage him, but he didn't want to tell him too much because he didn't want to get in trouble. So that's 3 U.S. flag officers. In fact, Vandegrift was a Medal of Honor winner. And not that he needed anything extra to be trustworthy. All 3 of those guys, their word was gold, and there was no question they were telling Nimitz the truth.
Right. Well, I think that's a pretty good place to leave off, but I just want to encourage folks to check out the book, Amelia Earhart, The Truth at Last. There's a lot of really great stuff, as you mentioned, photographs, and even though it's got a lot of citations, like a serious academic work that, if you want to go figure out what letter, a piece of information came from or anything came from, it's well cited, but it's also, very approachable in terms of reading, and so I'd suggest people check that out, and earharttruth.com, your website. And I think in the next episode, it would be good to cover stuff like the other notions that are out there about what happened to Earhart and why those aren't credible, and other stuff like the recent history documentary. I think that would be a good place to pick up.